My name is Stick Miller. I teach in philosophy, and I am director of the Program in Ethics and Public Life. This is the third in our series of talks on deep issues of the 2012 elections, equality, freedom, and democracy. Our speaker is David Schmidtz. He's Kendrick Professor of Philosophy at the University of Arizona, where he also has a joint appointment in economics. At the University of Arizona, he's founding director of the Center for the Philosophy of Freedom. In his wide-ranging work, Dave Schmidtz places fundamental emphasis on freedom. He deeply connects freedom with private property, and he emphasizes the role of free enterprise in prosperity. In some people, these emphases are accompanied by a certain distance from the lived experience and concrete realities of choice, aspiration, neediness, and suffering. In Dave's case, nothing could be farther from the truth. A philosopher whom Dave and I both admire has said that an ethic is the love of a way of life. With searching insight, deep sympathy, great open-mindedness, Dave always sheds light on the great human question of what ways of life are worthy of love. Some people write influentially. Some people write in stimulating ways. Those people are not always the same. Dave's wide-ranging work is invariably both influential and stimulating. It includes such books as Rational Choice and Moral Agency, Social Welfare and Individual Responsibility in Effective Debate with Robert Gooden, The Elements of Justice, and Person, Polis, and Planet. Planet being an emblem of Dave's work on environmental ethics, including the deepest, most puzzling questions about what a human's relation with nature ought to be. It includes many articles as well. One of my favorites is How to Deserve, in which the answer enriches a central debate in political philosophy, while defying everyone's efforts to associate Dave with one side or other of the debate. Well, that's classic Dave Schmidtz, that enrichment of a central debate in which Dave doesn't take sides but illuminates with deep insight and honesty. He'll be enriching our series today with his talk, Ideal for Real, Realistic Hopes for American Politics.
Thank you so much. So thank you. I'm touched by that introduction, and it really is an honor to be back in Ithaca, where I haven't been for a while. It's funny what can happen to make a place feel like home, and sometimes it's mysterious what makes a place feel like home, or what makes it coming back to a place feel like coming home. But actually, in my case, I know exactly why that is. It was 1992, 93, in there somewhere, was the first time I came out to Ithaca, and I gave a talk, a seminar in the philosophy department. And there's this fellow in the audience. I mean, Richard Miller doesn't really need an introduction. He introduced himself, but he's as good as they come and as famous as they come in our field. And even back then, when I was just starting out, I knew, to look and scope out the audience and see, okay, that guy's there's Terry Irwin, and there is Dick Miller. So, and what could I expect? But I finished my talk, and then there was questions, and Dick's hands, both hands, I think, were the first hands up, and he was not going to take no for an answer, so he got called on and said, "Do you realize your work has this implication?" And I said, "Well, yeah." "What? Shoot me." And he said, "Yeah, no, I thought that too. I was just checking to see if it had." "I have another question. Do you think, I mean, when I put this work and this other thing, when I put them together, doesn't it have that implication?" And I said, "Well, yeah, it does." I didn't really, but yeah, it does. So, okay, what? Shoot me. And he said, no, I just think that's really interesting. It's a tremendously fruitful, I mean, this is really a research agenda. I mean, it's going someplace that has all these implications. And I said, well, yeah, so that's it. I just wanted to say, oh, okay. So this is, like Dick says, I'm not a fellow that he spends a lot of his time agreeing with, but nevertheless, he still saw something in what I was doing, and I will never forget that. I will never stop being grateful for him doing something he really didn't need to do at all, which was to make me feel visible. And yeah, so that's why I feel here like I'm coming home. So what do you think of this? All men desire by nature to agree. Do you agree? I mean, of course, you shouldn't. If Aristotle had actually said that, he would have been talking about something that's actually, I would say, true. I would say we know that. It's pretty well confirmed by psychology today that is true of us. But that's something lamentable, not what Aristotle meant to be talking about. But this is actually one of the standard translations of the first line of the Metaphysics, actually. This is more like it. This, to have that desire, not to agree, but to desire to understand. To have that desire is to have achieved something, to have become something, not lamentable, but glorious. I mean, there's something admirable about being a creature aptly described by those words. Now, as theorists, it seems we do kind of idolize the idea of having views that can't reasonably be rejected, to use Scanlon's phrase. But suppose that you have two map makers, and maybe they're in your cartography class, and you assign them independently to map the same terrain, and they come up with identical maps. You would know that they cheated. People thinking independently, each desiring to understand, come up with different maps even if no one has made a mistake. Right? You can count on it. So long as people are thinking that's how it's going to be, and there's nothing bad about that. So thinking we should all be working with the same map, it's pointless. This is one of the only cultures in human history where your religion wasn't a reason to kill you. That's a big achievement. And how did that happen? Well, part of it was about a fellow named Roger Williams, who realized we don't need to be on the same page. We don't need to restrict ourselves into believing or saying what can't reasonably be rejected either. Right? That would be stifling. All we need to settle is who makes the call regarding any given person's religion or beliefs in general. We need to settle whose life it is, whose jurisdiction it is. That's about it. We can say the people made you who you are, provided the society in which you could become what you are, and therefore the people should choose your religion. Well, 4 centuries ago, Roger Williams realized how bogus that inference is, and he went on to invent America. Or actually, I should say something more complimentary. He invented America as it should have been. He bought Rhode Island with his own money from the Narragansett tribes. He didn't take it, he bought it. Every acre in Rhode Island was purchased. And he was, in effect, the father of a Rhode Island Constitution that went on to be the inspiration for the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So as teachers, we don't think that the gold standard of effective teaching is whether students agree with us. The gold standard is we give students something to think about. That's what grown-up teachers do. That's what made us love our best teachers. That's what made them our best teachers. The best of them gave us a question that stopped us and helped us see dimensions of which we hadn't previously dreamt. So if wonder and understanding are the gold standard of good teaching, at least in philosophy, why wouldn't that be the gold standard of good theorizing too, at least in philosophy? I give you that as a rhetorical question, and I do that self-consciously because it isn't an argument. It's just something to think about. So here's my map of what we do in political philosophy these days. And according to my map, your map will be different. That's no problem. That's how we learn. Here's one fact about our theorizing. We idealize. We simplify. Each of us, in our own way, tries to abstract from the details and home in on the essence. Of course, knowing that there's a risk that goes with that, the detail that we set aside might not be a detail for a given user. So suppose I give you a map of your town, Ithaca, and you come back and you say, you're furious. You can't believe I get paid to do such useless philosophy. There was a stalled car on Main Street, traffic backed up half a mile, and my road map was oblivious to that pivotal fact about what you had to do to get from point A to point B. And I say, well, you're right. That philosophy is supposed to help you understand how to navigate in your world. But it somehow isn't philosophy's job to warn you about ephemeral obstacles. You say, well, what is philosophy's job then? And I say, well, there are lots of cute answers to that. But a serious answer won't be a quip or a jingle. It won't be entertainment. It will be hard work. So let's talk about asteroids. Suppose there's an asteroid about to collide with the planet Earth. And, well, one proposal would be, we need to decide what to do. So one thing you could say is, well, in deciding what to do, we should couch our answer to that question, within the framework of a broader philosophical framework that starts by asking, what would be the thing to do under ideal conditions? So you say, well, under ideal conditions, there wouldn't be any asteroid hurtling at the planet Earth. And you say, something wrong there. Something about idealizing, it has a point, it's a functional thing, and that wasn't what we were supposed to be doing. So Isaac Newton said, well, friction, set that aside for a minute. That wasn't a mistake on his part. He wanted to illuminate a relationship with respect to which friction was inessential. But, suppose instead he had tackled the problem of how to predict the behavior of a parachute. If he'd said, friction, air resistance, let's set that aside, assume a vacuum. Well, that kind of idealization now would be a huge mistake. What's the difference? Well, because in that second idealization, it's the same idealization, let's ignore friction, but the thing is, in the second case, and in the case of the asteroid, the thing that we're setting aside is the problem. So that's one pretty simple lesson. We set aside details, and it's a goal-directed activity. So never forget the goal. Never set aside the problem. Suppose we raise the minimum wage by $100 to $100 an hour. And now, then, if some teenager somewhere is only worth $50 an hour, it becomes effectively illegal to employ that teenager. That's a real cost. Do we want to ignore that fact? Do we want to set it aside? Well, it depends. What's the problem? If our challenge is to construct rules of engagement that turn society into a cooperative venture for mutual advantage, where people are better off having each other as neighbors, where even the least advantaged have something to offer, then we will stop to ask, honestly, whether the upshot of what we're doing is to turn otherwise valuable talent into unemployable talent. It's not a distracting detail that some games are zero-sum, while other games are positive-sum. Some rules of engagement help to construct society as a land of opportunity. Some rules turn society into a land of corruption and crony capitalism, where you can't do business without buying exemptions under the table. So one way to evaluate proposed rules of engagement is to ask, will this prove that my heart is in the right place? Another way to evaluate a proposal is to ask, what will actually happen? And the thing is, if you're trying to prove that your heart is in the right place, it isn't. So, let's switch from the asteroid case to something real, something that actually happened in Tucson. So Tucson has, it's a growing city, rapidly growing city. It runs into problems, traffic problems, congestion problems. And so it has this scarce resource, roadways, wanted to manage that scarce resource efficiently. So you got a situation where you got 2 lanes going one way, 2 lanes coming the other way, and then in the middle is a left turn lane. So what they did was, on the roads that didn't have medians and things to mess things up, they took that middle lane and turned that into a straight through lane going downtown at 7 to 9 a.m. That same lane reversed polarity, as it were, and became a one-way lane coming out of downtown from 4 to 6 p.m. And then otherwise it remained a left turn lane. Now, what do you want to say about that? You want to say that, we're looking for, what's the ideal solution to this problem? But one way to run with that mandate is to say, what would be the ideal solution for ideal drivers? For ideal drivers, that's a very credible hypothesis, like people who are all on the same page, who get it, who understand the rule. For them, this might have been a very effective way of managing traffic. Change the example just a lot, and suppose that instead we're talking about a population of drivers, some of which are elderly people who just got to town and are not fast learners anymore, who don't get it. And it only takes one to mess things up quite badly. And in a town like that, which is a town like Tucson, a steady influx of people like that from rural areas, that was a prescription. What actually happened was road rage, accidents, and traffic jams. They proved their hearts were in the right place anyway, I guess. So the objective is to allocate traffic according to need by time of day. That was the problem. But the thing is that solving ideal problems or idealized problems, that is not a serious way of being an idealist. So Peter Singer, 1972, I think it was the first issue of Philosophy and Public Affairs, in which I think Wasserstrom's had an article on problem of dirty hands, and Judith Jarvis Thompson had the problem of abortion. I mean, what a stunning journal that was when it started out. I mean, it was incredible, game-changing. But also this article by Peter Singer, one of the seminal articles of the recent history of philosophy. So he talked about famine in East Bengal, Bangladesh at the time, Bengal, and he came up with this principle that was supposed to dictate a massive transfer of wealth from the West to famine countries. So if it's within our power to prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. Now this is, as he said, a pretty simple, obvious, compelling, intuitive idea. This cannot be altogether wrong. Right? It's telling us to do the best we can. That cannot be generically bad advice. I think only, and that's not the topic of the talk for tonight, I think only that this shows that we made a fundamental mistake about what the whole point of moral theorizing was, but that's another time, or maybe a dinner topic. But in any case, he said this, and the cash value of this was supposed to be that we were supposed to support famine relief organizations to the point of marginal utility. We give so much that the next dollar we give will do less good than keeping it. That the recipient of that dollar, the most needy person in the world, won't be more needy than we are. That's the point, to stop giving. So, what's the problem I want to talk about tonight? Many reasons for action in this world stem from the fact that this world is not a parametric world. This is a strategic world. It's a world in which other agents are responding to what we've done and also to what they can anticipate from us. How many people are familiar with the idea of a prisoner's dilemma? But not everyone, correct? All right. Not everyone? Okay. I'm not going to go into a bunch of detail on this. It's an interesting puzzle that really is one of the core puzzles and originating puzzles of game theory and so on, decision theory. But here's an intuitive motivation for it. Here's the idea. You're playing a game and you have two options. You contribute to a game that you're playing with your partner, or you don't contribute. And your partner also has a choice of either contribute to some kind of joint production or not contribute. And sometimes people think that this is an esoteric kind of situation, like how often do you find yourself charged with a crime and the district attorney makes you this offer? Not very often for most people. But here's another kind of situation you can run into. You walk into a corner store and you say, I'd like a quart of milk, and the manager either gives you that quart of milk or doesn't. And then you make an independent decision to either give that manager $1 or not. The manager says, I can't trust you. Yeah, I could give you the milk, but how do I know you're going to give me $1? And you say, well, I could give you the $1, but how do I know you're going to give me the milk? So, there it is. It's a theorem, the fundamental game theoretic theorem. Corner stores are impossible. You cannot buy milk. It cannot be done. Because you're playing your strategies independently. You just decide, do I give $1 or not? And somebody else just decides, maybe you never know who that person is, to give you a quart of milk or not, or maybe to give someone else a quart of milk that you intend to be benefited by that $1. And you're making that decision independently, and so, according to game theory, you have a dominant strategy of not giving the $1. And by the way, your partner has a dominant strategy of not giving you the milk. You give the person $1, the person says, great, thank you very much, and that's it. Then you walk out of the store empty-handed. or the manager gives you a quart of milk, and then you walk out of the store without having paid. Now, how's the real world dramatically different from that? Well, and how is morality dramatically different from that? You could suppose morality requires you to be an unconditional cooperator. You just give. And you hope that what you give will somehow, something that you want done in the world will happen if you just give. And everybody's in that situation. Okay, so that isn't the way the world works, and that isn't the way morality works either. If morality is about solving problems, if it's about doing things to encourage good results, good things, then morality is not about unconditional cooperation. It's about reciprocating, it's about playing what Robert Axelrod called tit for tat. Because tit for tat induces people to cooperate. Unconditional cooperation induces people to free ride. And if you think $1 is bad, try walking in with $1 million or $1 billion and say, I hope this does some good. I hope this, this results in 1 million or 1 billion quarts of milk going to places where people need it. And if you're really lucky, someone will say, oh, by the way, almost everybody in the region that you want that milk to go to is lactose intolerant. Have you thought about that? All right, well, maybe you have thought about that, maybe you haven't. But you hope for a good result. And somehow that is not what morality is about. This is not really utilitarianism. It's like, as Peter Singer is the arch utilitarian of the 20th century, and yet this isn't a principle about maximizing utility. This is a principle about doing something like sacrificing as much as possible. That's what it's telling you to do. He was remarkably cavalier about consequences when he published this thing in 1972. He said, aid organization, look, don't worry about it. Maybe there's a little bit of waste, but just, that doesn't change your obligation. Just give and keep giving until you'd starve if you gave more. As long as there's starving people, you give until you'd starve if you gave more. That's about giving as much as possible. That's not about doing as much good as possible. And so, I don't think that's even compatible with something like the principle of utility. Or if it is, then the principle of utility isn't exactly compatible with itself. It isn't compatible with getting good results, with caring about doing what gets good results. So, I don't know that Peter Singer ever explicitly admitted that, but implicitly he has, seems to have changed his mind about this, and now today he's talking about microbanks, which is, I think, an altogether good idea. It makes perfect sense to me for a utilitarian to be talking about microbanks. Why? Well, one reason is that microbanks don't make billion-dollar mistakes. And if you're an unconditional cooperator and you show up and bang, you drop like $1 billion on the counter, your manager is not going to be some 18-year-old kid. That manager is going to be the mafia or some brutal dictator. Because for $1 billion, they'll do what needs doing in order to be the person who receives that unconditional contribution. So it's even worse as a function of rising dollar values, the rising value of what you're contributing here. So now he's talking about microbanks because they don't make billion-dollar mistakes. Okay. Amartya Sen won a Nobel Prize in economics in 1998. He claimed to document that in every significant famine in the 20th century, there was plenty of food within the country. For some reason, the food didn't go where it needed to go. Why was that? In 1958 to 61, China had its version of a great leap forward. It was the largest famine in recorded history. By Sen's estimate, 30 million people died. The runner-up in the 20th century is Stalin's genocidal collectivization of the Ukraine, where maybe 7 to 10 million people died from starvation in 32, 33 as the world looked on without protest. So we could ask whether progressives everywhere, and who closed ranks and pretended, I say ignoring the screams of 30 million Kitty Genoveses, whether these people had their hearts in the right place. But Sen's answer is, having your heart in the right place starts with caring about what works. Sen's thesis, of the many famines in the 20th century, not one occurred in a democracy. He hastens to add, well, there were famines in nominally democratic Niger and Zimbabwe. So more precisely, there are no famines in a functioning democracy. And Sen adds, functioning is the key word here. Well, which is to say democracy is not the key word. And Sen implicitly, he says, the famine eradicating, this isn't a quotation, it's a paraphrase, but the famine eradicating Western culture is not particularly democratic, at least when democracy is thought of as public reasoning. Okay, well, part of democracy's secret, when it's working, would be this. A successful, does this seem paradoxical? A successful democracy limits the reach of democracy. Successful democracies are constitutional democracies. Successful democracy limits the reach of top-down rulers. It imposes a system of checks and balances without which democracy slides into tyranny. Have you ever been part of a university or a reading group? Have you ever been part of a business, anything? Well, you know that something happens to people, we call them petty bureaucrats, petty tyrants, things like that. People who think that they aren't answerable to some higher authority, like even in little things, they become tyrannical. And so that's been one of the secrets of democracy, is really nobody is unaccountable. Nobody is beyond being accountable. So a successful democracy acknowledges some kind of sphere of, I'd call it liberalism, where individuals, for the most part, make the call about how to run their own lives, thereby making space to make decisions on the ground for people in decentralized fashion, farmers, truckers, grocers on the ground, where the mistakes are on a small scale, from which others can learn, rather than on a scale that crushes whole communities. As when you plant the whole region with a certain crop, and that crop turns out not to be edible for one reason or another. Okay, so that's why I would guess democracy correlates strongly with the end of famine, because, or insofar as it decentralizes decision making. Sen says, this is a quotation, that the history of famine has, in fact, had a close connection with authoritarian rule. So 20th century famines, they were caused by eroding rights, not eroding soil. The true problem is something is making farmers in that part of the world unable to make a living by meeting consumer demand. Farming doesn't pay in that part of the world. Part of what Sen means by functional democracy, he goes on to say, is a society where there's a free press. Now, in ideal theory, it's a little hard to explain the point of a free press. You have your benevolent dictator, and that's that. What do you need a press for? But in the non-ideal world, the free press is an imperfect but crucial check on limited knowledge, limited power, and, frankly, limited integrity. So as Sen says, one feature of life in a free country is unrestrained criticism of the ruling party. Public intellectuals scorn a news network when it fawns over a ruler, as opposed to doing so when it declines to fawn over a ruler. When it becomes common for public intellectuals to consult the White House about which media sources to scorn, you are sliding into tyranny, even if you broadly agree with the agenda. In a free country, investigative journalists expose corporations for colluding with government, not for standing against it. So when pundits start looking to White House press releases for info on which corporations to go after, you are sliding into tyranny. Sen finds it crucial that leaders be made to listen. I can't disagree with that, but a complementary key I would add is that it's crucial that citizens don't need to listen to people who presume to lead. It's a core part of the liberal rule of law, not being subject to a tyrant's arbitrary will. Farmers have to be free to ignore orders to cease growing food, or to vacate land to make room for worker cooperatives or multinational exporters, to abstain from bringing food to market and competing with a politically anointed cartel. A leader's duty to listen and a citizen's right to ignore are crucial limits on creeping tyranny, but the right to ignore is the more defining characteristic, I would say, of non-authoritarian society, and probably also more consistently the functional property that obliterates famine. So, this is an admittedly idiosyncratic characterization on my part, but I'd say functional democracy reduces our need to be on the same page. It minimizes the need for public reasoning. It minimizes the cost of diversity, of living in a sea of neighbors who are different, and in that way makes a huge contribution to the overwhelmingly important project of maximizing the net benefits of diversity. So functional democracy enlarges the sphere in which it makes sense to speak of people as minding their own business, even if they grew up in a society, even if they had genes, whatever. Free to explore what may turn out to be a new idea, so long as they aren't a menace to fellow citizens. Now, Sen knows, he stresses, few politicians are all that far-sighted, and often their close-up vision is not so good either. Isolated from local circumstances, they can't see what they're doing or what needs doing. That actually was an illustration of my prisoner's dilemma story. So Sen says the history of famine has had a peculiar relation with authoritarian rule. And here's what he says about the land where he grew up. He wasn't a victim of starvation. His family was rich, but it was happening all around him. He says New Delhi, and he's not that critical, and I think it's really impressive for Sen. I could understand Sen if he were just frothing at the mouth, spitting mad about this, but he's not. He's actually quite diplomatic about it. So more power to him. But he says New Delhi had suspended the trade in rice and food grains between the Indian provinces so that food could not move through legitimate channels of private trade, despite the much higher price of food in Bengal. That's what crises do. The price starts rising, and you recoil from that. You say you shouldn't raise the price in emergency conditions. But the thing is, when you raise the price, supply increases. That's the point. So that would have solved the problem with, as food actually became more valuable, for people to be treating it as an even more scarce resource than it had been before. That would have solved the problem. But Amartya Sen says that kind of deal-making had been suspended. Too bad. So Sen warns against idealizing rulers, right? Against assuming that principles will be implemented or policies will be implemented by philosopher kings. And if those who successfully compete for power won't be philosophy kings, I ask you, should that limit how much power we want them to hold? So I think about who actually ends up running countries, ruling countries like the USA or Syria or whatever. So assume what's historically true. Any power we create will be held by people like that. Accordingly, an ideal theory that matters, it won't ask, well, ideally, how much power would be held by ideal rulers. It'll say, ideally, how much power should be held by people like that. I was in Istanbul recently talking about Hayek, I guess, some stuff about market principles and so on. And yeah, we got into talking about spontaneous order, but you know, an overarching framework of the rule of law that's supposed to be the framework within which it's supposed to be the ecological niche within which markets evolve and deal making evolves. And somebody actually said, well, the kind of thing you're talking about, a kind of system which, you know, if you had your way, you're talking about like your country could come to be ruled by Mitt Romney. And she actually said Mitt Romney. And I'm thinking, hello, you don't think that could happen in the world we live in now? Like, I can't believe you gave that as an example. But how much power would you want to be held by people like that? So I'm not saying merely that a scheme for managing ideal drivers or ideal bureaucrats isn't practical. I'm saying it isn't ideal either. Whether a system would work for ideal drivers doesn't say anything in its favor, even as a principle. It's unfit for humans, period. Okay, now next, I guess I want to talk about Kazakhstan, although this will be, yeah. The Singer principle is a suggestion about how to promote value, maximize the promotion of value. But promoting value, even if we were consequentialists, which I get accused of being as much as anything else, and I don't think that's correct, but promoting value would not be the only thing to do if either of two conditions, either if value itself isn't the only concern, or if there are times when the correct response to value isn't promoting it, it's simply respecting it. So under what conditions would that be true? Would the thing to do be to respect value rather than promote it? You might think if we were assessing things in consequentialist terms, that would be never. It would always be about promoting value. That's not so. Here's why. So two notorious thought experiments. One is trolley, and I think, I was told this is a general audience, but my sense of the hands going up before, it's a pretty well informed. How many people have heard of trolley, and how many people haven't? Man, we live in a sad world. So many people have heard of trolley, but there you go. Well, this is a thought experiment, and a fruitful one. If a trolley is rolling down the track on its way to killing 5 people, what should you do? Well, you have options. You can switch to another track where there's only one, and if you do that, well, you will be saving 5 and killing 1, or maybe letting 1 die, something like that. So it seems like if you go with the numbers, the utilitarian intuition here is pretty clear. And actually, most people say that you should switch the track. Something that appears to have an identical logic, but it does not elicit identical intuitions, which is 5 patients dying for lack of organ donors, and a UPS delivery person walks in, turns out to be a suitable donor who could has the organs to save all 5 patients, and if you kidnap her, harvest her organs, you'll be killing her, but you'll save 5 patients. And here most people say, you can't do that. And that's interesting. Why would people have different intuitions? I've presented this kind of cases. I used to teach it in my classes. I've presented it to lots of audiences, trying to give them a sense of the fun that philosophy can be. I've talked to congressional staffers. I've talked to post-Soviet professors in Kazakhstan, and they all say the same thing pretty much. They say, there just has to be another way. And I say, look, come on. Okay. I'll get back to that. But trolley tells us that the numbers matter. Hospital seems to tell us the same thing. And so why don't we get the same intuition? Well, one thing I haven't heard mentioned, there's lots of theories, but hospitals tell us that sometimes what matters is being able to trust people to respect us as separate persons. Sorry, but even a utilitarian has to care about that. Hospitals can't exist, and more generally, we can't live together unless we can trust each other to acknowledge that we all have lives of our own. Hospital shows that we sometimes get the best result. A community of people living well together, able to help each other, willing to help each other, not by aiming at a result so much as just by being trustworthy, so people can plan to deal with us in mutually beneficial ways. That corner store problem, we're so good at solving it, we don't even notice we have a problem. We just go in, pay, walk out with the milk. That's it. Nobody even thinks of themselves as having solved a problem that game theory tells us is unsolvable. So to a cartoon utilitarian thinking about trolley, all that matters is numbers. But in a more realistic institutional context like hospital, we intuitively grasp something that's more fundamental, which is if we don't take seriously rights and separate personhood, we won't get justice. We won't even get good numbers. That's why it has to be true that morality sometimes is about respecting value, not because value doesn't matter, but precisely because it does. So some utilitarians find it a mystery why morality would incorporate any constraints beyond a requirement to do whatever maximizes the good. But from an institutional perspective, there's no mystery. Moral institutions constrain the good's pursuit because the good is pursued by individuals, like those smiling faces I had up earlier, for example. So moral institutions get the best result, not so much by aiming at the best result as by imposing constraints on individual pursuits so as to bring individual pursuits into harmony with each other, so as to make individual pursuits less threatening to each other. Institutions like hospitals, they can serve the common good by leaving well enough alone, by creating opportunities for mutual benefit, and then trusting individuals to take advantage. That's how, even from a utilitarian perspective, institutions have a moral mandate to serve the common good that does not collapse into a mandate for ordinary moral agents to maximize utility. So in effect, there are two ways in which institutional utility is based on trust. First, people have to be able to trust their society to treat them as rights bearers, otherwise they want to leave, and rightly so. Second, society must in turn trust people to use the opportunities that they have as rights bearers within a society. Acts are not the important thing in the long run. They're not the main variable upon which long-run utility depends. The ceiling of possibility itself is the main variable. An optimizer on the ground in Bangladesh can only do so much. What Bengalis need is not to optimize or to be surrounded by optimizers, so much as to live in a society with a Western-style ceiling, where people, men and women, people of all religions, all castes, and so on, have the opportunity and the responsibility to do what meets needs, namely to produce. So a reflective consequentialist morality is not about 1 versus 5. It's not even about costs versus benefits. It's about how we need to live in order to be glad that we're neighbors. It's about getting on with our lives in a way that complements rather than hinders our neighbors' efforts to get on with their lives. It accepts this reflective consequentialist morality. It accepts constraints on optimizing so as to have a higher ceiling. So if you're a legislator in 2012, suppose you have a chance to create the power to sacrifice the few for the sake of the many. You can decide whether to create that power, I'm supposing, but you will not be able to control who acquires that power or what they'll use it for. What would make us think that we should help to create that kind of power? What would make us think we have the right? So ideally, that power would be held by a philosopher king. Is that even relevant? So what's a realistic hope for American politics? Dick suggested that as a subtitle for my talk, and I was talking to Danielle and Delphia and Arthur and Sheila and Casey and this afternoon, and they asked me whether I had an answer, and said, man, I better think about this. Okay, so realistic hope. The American founders created a constitutional democracy in response to a problem. how to create a free society that would not degenerate into tyranny. Now, they would have liked to have a permanent solution. They did not think that they had found one. They did think that they had come up with a solution that might not unravel for centuries, and that in the meantime might blow the lid off human progress. They did succeed in doing that because they came up with a plan for a culture that would hold rulers accountable to a constitution, okay, as well as to an unreservedly critical free press. That would hold rulers in check, at least for a while. So citizens today still have tremendous freedom to mind their own business. And wherever we have that, and to whatever extent we have that, we will continue to be a know-how, can-do nation, and we will continue to do amazing things. So my last thought then, by way of conclusion, experimental psychologists sometimes demonstrate repeatedly that subjects' intuitions regarding such things as probability and logical implication, they become more unreliable as the experimental context becomes more abstract or more unworldly. So there's this Wasson card selection test, and you say, well, okay, which of these cards have to be turned over so that you know whether letters and capital letters on one side are associated with odd numbers on the other side or something like that. And about 25% of people get it right. And then they say, Giga Renzer said anyway, let's change the example just slightly without really changing it at all. If you're in a bar and there's like an old person and a very young person, and someone orders a Coke and someone who orders a whiskey, which of them do you have to ask for ID? How many people get that right? 100%. Same problem, actually. So, the abstracting from, a concrete context in which we understand the point of the reasoning, turns out we're just a lot better than that. And you make it really abstract, you make it about asteroids or twin Earth or H3O, whatever, we're just not as good at that. Now, so in the face of that, you wonder, why can philosophers still treat intuitive moral reactions to unworldly thought experiments as if those intuitions were reliable? And I think, well, there's no good reason. Their teachers did it, so they did it. But I'm glad, Singer doesn't partake of that tradition very much. He's invented some very shallow pond, some very famous examples, but he doesn't do it that much. And it's not my style either. But I am glad that I did it in Kazakhstan, and here's why. So wherever I go, whatever my audience is, they tend to say, look, there has to be another way. And until Kazakhstan, I used to say, hey, everybody, listen, come on, pay attention for a second. It's a philosophical example. Just get with the program. There is no other way. You're meant to, it's about 5 versus 1. So you're supposed to say what would happen when you're, do you let 5 people die? Do you kill one? Just go with me. Just work with me on the problem. There's no other way. It's stipulated. Get real. Answer. Now, so these people weren't kids, post-Soviet professors, and I said, there are going to be language problems. Just call a timeout when you need to figure out what's going on. I said they call a timeout, and they get together, 27 of them, getting together to discuss this. And they discuss it for a few minutes in Russian. It's animated. And then they turn back to me, and they've got a spokesman now, and the spokesman says, oh yes, we've heard this before, about how the few have to be sacrificed for the sake of the many. Yeah, there's no other way. We've heard that. It was a lie. There was always another way. And so I don't talk about that example very much anymore, except to apologize for having inflicted it on so many students over the years. In the real world, there is another way. So when leaders call on us to help them sacrifice the few for the sake of the many, we will want to go along. Partly because we are so terribly vulnerable to that desire to agree. And also partly because we're like kids being recruited by a playground bully and wanting to do whatever it takes to delay the day when our name shows up on that list of people to be sacrificed. So when that call comes, that is going to be our final exam as human beings. And we'll want to comply. Justice will be about finding another way. Thank you. Sure.
They would be glad to talk about questions, and we'd be glad to hear your comments. Would you stand up and address us? It's a way in which we can hear everybody in this discussion. So, questions? Comments? Yes?
Question, because anyway, it was really terrific and I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
And I understood what you said about the famine in China and the famine under Stalin, about the horrendous that they have to contact. But what about two of the other great famines in the 20th century, the Bengali famine in 1943, and then the famine in the Philippines that occurred in the context of the American occupation during the Spanish War, that were managed from a distance by democratic governments. How do you fit those into your framework?
Okay, so the question is, there were two big famines, but the Bengali famine was another one in which, well, there was a colonial government.
It was in 1943,
Yeah.
And there were millions of people who died. And also during the Spanish-American War, during the period of the Civil War that occurred when America was fighting, there was a famine. I think about 1 million people died. And I can't give you the name of the book. So they occurred in contexts that were managed from a distance by democratic governments. And then if you go back to the 19th century, of course, there's the Irish famine.
Yeah.
I'm just curious if
yeah.
you put them in your framework.
Okay, so there are lots of famines. I think so. I'm talking about Sen's thesis, and I think Sen might say I get off on that one because all I talked about was 20th century famines. We're not talking about 20th century famine, are we?
1943 was the Bengali.
Oh, okay. Yeah. No, 43. That's fine. Yeah. So, I don't know what actually what Sen means to say about that, but I would say my own view would be more in line with what I think you're suggesting is, which is, and actually Sen says some things along this line too, which is to say it's distance. It's people being distanced from the problem that causes the problem. And he says, when it comes to democratic government, that people are answerable. They have to answer to their constituents, their subjects, and so on. And so, yeah, we could leave aside the thing about democracy, but I do think distance has a lot to do with a lot of the atrocities that. There are not many people who have the stomach to kill someone with a knife, but to push a button, yeah.
Right. I'm just thinking that democracies aren't necessarily uninvolved either.
Sure. Sure. That's fair enough. I don't know of any way to quarrel with that, but I do think focusing on the distance is relevant. Focusing on, I think focusing on our limitations. As we get distant, it's not just that we lose empathy, it's that, in a way, we're treating the problem as if it had a much bigger scope. And that sounds like a good thing, but it isn't it isn't always a good thing that if the rulers just said, we're tossing up our hands here, I tell you what, we're getting out of the way, sink or swim. You might have starvation, you might have lots of people dying, you wouldn't have millions of people dying. Now another thing to say is, I talked, there, in that slide, Sen says that the local authorities were exporting food from places where people were dying. Now that sounds heinous. There's no question that there were people who knew better. Maybe not. Maybe it was England that was deciding that, and so maybe they just didn't know. That's possible. But here's another curious thing. Around 700 BC, populations in Greece were starting to increase, and the land was only so fertile. And they were getting to a point where they said, we're going to get to a point where our population has overgrown our ability to grow food for them. So you know what they did? They said, forget wheat. From now on, we're planting olives and grapes. That's it. And we're going to export it. We're going to export olive oil, and we're going to export wine. And so you say, boy, that sounds a lot like, fiddling as Rome burns, right? That sounds catastrophically inconsiderate, say. But in fact, they had a reason. This is what I've read anyway. They had a real reason for doing it. They said, okay, really, we're not making this problem up. We really don't have enough acreage to grow enough wheat to feed people. But I tell you what we can do, we have enough acreage to produce a much more valuable crop, wine and olive oil, and we can sell that crop for enough to buy enough wheat to feed our people. So actually, an acre of land can feed more people by growing grapes than by growing wheat. It can provide more wheat by planting grapes than by planting wheat, depending upon the nature of your economy. So that's why in 700 BC that they switched. I don't suppose that lets anybody in Bangladesh off the hook, but it does go to show that these people, to say the least, they were not proving that their heart was in the right place, right? They were doing something that looked heinous. And the actual result of what they were doing was that people didn't starve. Whereas if they'd proven that their heart was in the right place, people would have starved. At least that was the theory.
Could you connect some of what you said towards the end to the problems? Unfortunately, they're not as scary, they're not as terrifying. That people do face in American politics. I'm going to lose under the Affordable Care Act. I have perfectly good health insurance, and my contributions to the healthcare system are going to be larger than they would otherwise be, and I think that's great because it will contribute to people who are now uninsured, being insured, people who don't have good health coverage, better health coverage. When there's a school board election, I gladly support candidates who are going to be for higher school taxes, which even if my daughter were younger than she is, really wouldn't help her because our school was okay. We could supplement. We read to her when she was young. It's for kids in poor families. So no question that if this was a matter of my being killed so that lots of people wouldn't suffer in the healthcare system, or of a major sacrifice to me and my daughter so that people could get a better education, I'd be against it. It's not at all like those trade-offs where one doesn't want to say there's got to be another way. Those are the trade-offs involving doing something to favor people, such as me, to help people who are needing to do things in American politics. Is there a caution that I should take more seriously that follows from your analyses of these
Okay, so there's a question about what do we do in less tragic, more ordinary cases of ordinary American life and American politics, where the decisions we're making are about providing adequate education or adequately comprehensive education, or maybe adequately comprehensive health care. And I would say that I would guess, knowing you somewhat, that you would not do either of those things in a knee-jerk way. You would be very aware of how much it's costing you, and you'd be willing to do it, but you wouldn't say, I will do it in order to prove that my heart is in the right place. And if that results in poor people having to pay more for health insurance, well, at least I've proven that my heart is in the right place. That's not the way you look at it. Maybe you don't do it for your daughter, but you do it in the thought that you have good reason to think that other people's children anyway will be better educated as a result. And so that is what I'm concerned about, and I think it's easy to say. It sounds obvious to me what I'm saying, but I think a lot of people, in fact, are proving that their hearts are in the right place. And I do think, the vote on the Affordable Care Act was taken something like 24 hours after it was written. And so literally no one voting on it had even read it, not even the hundreds of people who had written it. Even they hadn't read it. They contributed a few pages, but literally it was thousands of pages long. So people voted on it without reading it. And when somebody asked Nancy Pelosi, I think, whether this was even constitutional, she said, "Constitution? Are you joking?" So I think that was something that needed to be thought over much more carefully. I mean, it should have been clear that it was going to be very costly. And there were people who came along later who said, "Oh yeah, I wrote 400 pages of that," and lobbyists, and who said, "Yeah." And the only thing in my 400 pages that made any difference at all was there was a footnote in the middle of it that said, "By the way, this repeals a restriction against opening up a casino on the Indian reservation," which I subsequently was then able to open up. And so people did things like that, and if the sums of money involved or the amounts of power involved are huge enough, I think you can bank on that being an issue. You can bank on a lot of those thousands of pages being smokescreen. So I guess another thing I'd say is, that's a worry. That's just a generic worry. Another worry would be, it's one thing to be willing to believe Peter Singer, say, to the extent of getting out your own wallet and sending money to your school board or something like that. And it really is a different thing to be voting or deciding to spend other people's money on it. And, we have to do that, so I'm not saying that that's, generically wrong or anything. What I'm saying is that, in fact, that's a different game, and it's a game that elicits different players and gets different results because there are different players playing that game. Guys like Jack Abramoff and so on. So I think that is, I'm supposed to be talking about realistic hope, and I guess I have only so much hope about that. Did you see the vice presidential debate the other day? Okay, so you remember something not many people talked about, but Paul Ryan got asked what he thought about right to life and abortion rights or so on. And to me, I thought, oh man, I like Paul Ryan, but what he just said yay, it's going to cost him the election, the Republicans will lose the election, and B, they will deserve to lose. So I thought that was a terrible thing, and I also thought, in a way, it wasn't even what he believed, and it wasn't his place to say that, yeah, I got my personal beliefs. I think he should have said, you know, there are lots of good things in the world. I have a view about what it would be good to do here, what would be valuable, not even just what would be respectful of human life. I have a view about that, but I'm running for a prominent position in the federal government, and that position has nothing to do with the question you just asked. I mean, he could have said, states used to make this decision, and some of them made the right decision, some of them made the wrong decision. You and I might disagree about which was right, which was wrong, but I tell you, I'm very sure it's not a question for vice presidential candidates. I'm not involved with this. I'm not going to be involved with this. I'm a member of the Tea Party, but the Tea Party came into being not to focus on that issue, but to focus on the economy. So I think he should have said, the reason why I'm saying that is to say, there are only so many things that are the federal government's business. There are only so many things, good thing for somebody to do, that the federal government should be doing. So even state governments, I think, of all kinds of jobs that the federal government shouldn't meddle in. Even if it's good to do, the federal government shouldn't be meddling in it. So I guess that's my view about that if we centralized the curriculum for the entire country, which there's some reason to do, right? But I think if we did that, that would be a catastrophe. And what you've got is lots of schools, school districts, independent schools, charter schools, private schools, all over the place, doing some things that to us seem, you and I would agree, just seem, that's really pretty nasty. That's pretty nasty to be teaching your children that. But it's pretty hard to do better than to let parents be in charge of knowing and caring about what their kids should be learning. And of course, some of them will make mistakes, but you won't get somebody making mistakes with the whole country.
I just had a quick question. I'm glad you brought up the national curriculum as an example of particularly catastrophic overreach of centralizing power, because I wouldn't agree with you 100% that it could be disastrous. But what I'm concerned about in terms of realistic vision for American power is in the context of the United States right now in 2012. Certainly, adhering to basic constitutional principles, the Bill of Rights, the Fourth Amendment, the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, all these things, holding them sacred could help correct some of the things that have gone wrong in that budget. But there's concentrations of power outside of tyrannical government power that the example you just met about the curriculum brings up in my mind, because in fact the power of huge corporate interests can influence my life against my will just as powerfully as a government legislating something. For example, as a social studies history teacher, I have to use textbooks that are produced by major corporations that are heavily, disproportionately influenced by huge statewide buying systems, like, for example, Texas. So when I teach U.S. history, I'm forced to adopt a book in many school districts throughout the nation, not just in Texas, trying to rewrite history in a way that I find quite offensive. Trying to say that Thomas Jefferson, for example, had no opinion on separation of church and state. Or that perhaps slavery wasn't such a bad thing. In other words, rewritten in the direction far to the extreme right of what I think, in fact, the facts show, back in the historian, studied history at Cornell, and know something about what actually Thomas Jefferson actually did say. I find it offensive that I'm supposed to teach a myth rather than something that's there. And that has nothing to do with government overreach whatsoever. That has to do with the power of the free market, of a large corporation somewhere deciding that it makes a lot of sense to listen to this huge purchasing power in Texas and to ignore what a school teacher in New England or a school teacher in Oregon might think about the results of that. So I think it speaks to that. concerned about the tyranny of the free market
Yeah.
as you are the tyranny of government overreach.
Okay, so the question is whether am I comparably afraid of the tyranny of, say, big corporations as I am of big government, knowing the kind of influence that they can have. So I guess I would say, first of all, I think not all problems have solutions. I know I don't have solutions for all problems. Second thing is, I don't think of myself as a giddy optimist about anything, including the market. So what makes me, say, distrustful of big government is not that I do trust big business. That's a different issue. It's not that I'm giddy about markets. Is that political decision making frightens and regularly disappoints me. So the first thing I would say about crony capitalism, say, and just big capitalism is, in a way, it's another example, in a way, of the problem that I think Emily was talking about, which is to say distance. That corporations get big, and Karl Marx wrote about exploitation and alienation, and Charles Dickens that ran with it as if, and you got the idea that it's only in sweatshops that there's such a thing as this, but no, and Marx himself knew, and now we've got, it's a cartoon. It's called Dilbert, and it's a joke because it's so true. That white collar jobs can be that alienating and that disempowering in a way. As you get in a big bureaucracy, you can have that little power. In 1994, I think, an NPR reporter asked Bill Clinton what was his biggest surprise after 2 years in office, and he said, "Easy, how little power a president has." So even presidents can feel pretty frustrated, and I think when they feel frustrated, that's a really good thing. Yeah, corporations, their size and distance can lead them to be oriented to whatever share prices and things like that don't reflect the quality of the product or how much better off customers are to have access to it. So yeah, I think all of that is a problem. It's a ubiquitous problem. And I think those people who don't care, I guess the first item on my list, I don't know who they are exactly, but the first item on my list would be not to allow them to buy and sell politicians. And of course, that happens every day now. And so that, I think, is a big problem. Do I blame that on corporations? No, I guess I don't. Because I think, if I thought we've got to do something to stop a cocaine epidemic or something like that, I wouldn't say we need to go after anybody who's got $10 to buy a piece of crack. I'd say it's the sellers that we need to go after. It's the crack itself, not the fact that too many people have enough money to buy some. So I think that too many people are rich enough. They have all the other toys that money can buy, so they start buying and selling politicians like they were baseball cards or something like that. I think it's not that there's too much money. I'm not sure it's even exactly too much money in politics, but surely that's a legitimate. Well, there's that much power for sale. I mean, that power is really valuable, right? I mean, if you say, hey, if I get to acquire this much power, then I get to have a whole state full of people buy my textbook at a price of my choosing. Now, if it were customers on the ground making that decision, that would be harder. But they have enough distance that they're working through intermediaries, and they say, no, you know what? The genius of this is it's taxpayers who are going to buy those textbooks, not anybody who has a choice. I'm not sure what the situation is there, but you know that makes it worse. So yeah, it's a problem, but I think distance is part of the issue. Localized decision making as much as you can. Get people looking in the faces at the people who they're proposing to give the bill to, and try to keep the amount of power that's being bought and sold from being worth billions of dollars on up. Hey, John.
Very somber note when you said that we will in fact continue to say yes to wanting to be understood by, not understood, to share opinions with others, and that the real search for justice is on another path. That's rough translation of what I just read. I should say that I'm not a philosopher, so there may be holes in what I understand. But you also pointed out consistently, you did it just again in response to the question about the book, that you equated really decentralization with a functioning democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And in the most dramatic...
Yeah, that's idiosyncratic, but I do in fact do that.
Yeah, exactly, okay. And you point out that there is an inherent conflict, I put it consistently this way, but an inherent conflict between the heart, as you call it, leading with your heart, as opposed to caring about good results. Once in your talking, you suggested that the gap wasn't enormous. The rest of the time, they were pitted against each other. So my real question to you is, how then would you suggest in this real politics, how would you suggest we as Americans in 2012 can create a society that emphasizes or allows for the development of a common good, to quote your word, that will help create a society in which we can live in order to be glad to be neighbors? That's not a simple thing to do, it strikes me. And I want to know how, given these premises that you have, how would you deal with that very real issue that you raised?
Okay, so thank you. The question is, in 2012, how do you deal with moving forward and in building or rebuilding a society in which people of goodwill are not only oriented toward the common good in some theoretical sense, but actually actively on the ground caring about it, trying to figure out what works. So I would say we live in a situation in which there's an overload of information, including an overload maybe of bad information, but still there's a lot of information out there, and that's good. We are a very busy people, busier than we've ever been before. My phone is in my pocket, and it has rung 4 times while I've been standing here. I don't know if you could hear it, but yeah, I hired somebody to be a business manager for the center. It was a one-man operation, and I hired her, and so she said, "What's my job description?" And I said, "Oh, job description, all right, let's do that." And she said, "Well, what do you need? What are your problems right now?" I said, "Email is out of control." And she said, "I'm on it, I got it." So she came back after an hour, and she was white. And she said, "I handled 30 real emails in the past hour. I mean, I was efficient, I got a lot done. And at the end of that hour, there was more in your inbox than when I started. So she said, this is not a doable job. This cannot be done. I want to work for you, but you got to give me a job that can be done. If it can be done by anybody, I can do it. But this can't be done by anybody. Sorry. So I said, well, how about if you do everything else in my life? And she said, okay, I'll try that. And she's been happy ever since. But yeah, so that is, we labor under conditions where we're so limited in what we can know and what we can do. And I'm quite disturbed and worried about that. Not that I'm not optimistic about it in some sense, but I guess I'd say it's amazing the extent to which all the information we have, and we're still voting on basically unknown quantities. Right? People will say, 30 seconds, my opponent is really bad. I mean, really bad. And like that's what you get. My opponent voted 30 times to raise his own pay or something. And it's like, well, I don't even know what that means. Like, was this part of some other bill? What happened? And so you don't know who you're voting for. Even if the information is part of the public record, you don't have time to go dig it up, or you don't have the information processing skills to go dig it up. It's like, that guy said he's on your side, and the other guy said he's on your side, and who do you believe? You kind of guess because the stakes are so low anyway. I mean, you think, this is actually tremendously important. Like, what I pay for health insurance will go up thousands of dollars here, depending upon which way this goes. So maybe you know that, but you don't know if it's going to be worth it. You don't even know that, and if you did know that, you wouldn't know if it was going to be worth it. So, but the thing is, the value of your vote is worth not even, like an infinitesimal fraction of a penny when you look at the probability of your vote making a difference. And I used to say, if I could just decide, I don't think that anymore, but maybe I was just more ignorant then, but I used to think, if I were the deciding vote and I could pick that person or that person, it still wouldn't make any difference. They're still going to go to Washington or the state legislature or whatever, and they're going to do whatever they do. Maybe ineffectively, they'll vote on something, it'll make a difference or it won't. But even that, even being a deciding vote doesn't really change things. Now I think, no, actually, they're really, I'm from Canada, but I come down here, and yeah, Democrats, Republicans, that's not, these really are different parties. They really do stand for different things, and their policies really do have different effects. So I think if I were deciding vote today, I would consider my vote to be pretty valuable. But that's the thing. There's so little that we can do individually that it's not worth figuring out in this complex world what would be the right thing to do. And so if you have millions of voters all feeling the same way, you think if they had just a tiny bit, there are theorems. If everybody had just a tiny bit better than random chance of being right, then you have 1 million voters, that's probably going to shake out enough noise that you're actually going to systematically get the right decision. But we aren't better than random. And in fact, people are making a living trying to make sure we aren't better than random. Like, what stupid thing can we say that they will buy? So,
in 2 weeks, Harry Brighouse will come and talk to us about equality of opportunity and educational policy in the United States. Right now, we've had, I don't know if he gave us realistic hope. That wasn't so hopeful just now. But lots of food for thought for people who want to do the right thing and to be, I guess, stopped in their tracks sometimes by reflections of days.
Well, thank you. It's a great honor to be here and to be at Cornell, to be part of the series, and it's going to be great when Harry Brighouse comes. He's really terrific, so you will enjoy his visit very much.
Well, let's thank Dave.
Thank you. The best of them gave us a question that stopped us and helped us see dimensions of which we hadn't previously dreamt. So if wonder and understanding are the gold standard of good teaching, at least in philosophy, why wouldn't that be the gold standard of good theorizing too, at least in philosophy? I give you that as a rhetorical question, and I do that self-consciously, because it isn't an argument. It's just something to think about. So here's my map of what we do in political philosophy these days. And according to my map, your map will be different. That's no problem. That's how we learn. Here's one fact about our theorizing. We idealize. We simplify. Each of us, in our own way, tries to abstract from the details and home in on the essence. Of course, knowing that there's a risk that goes with that, the detail that we set aside might not be a detail for a given user. So suppose I give you a map of your town, Ithaca, and you come back and you say, you're furious. You can't believe I get paid to do such useless philosophy. There was a stalled car on Main Street, traffic backed up half a mile, and my road map was oblivious to that pivotal fact about what you had to do to get from point A to point B. And I say, well, you're right. That philosophy is supposed to help you understand how to navigate in your world. But it somehow isn't philosophy's job to warn you about ephemeral obstacles. You say, well, what is philosophy's job then? And I say, well, there are lots of cute answers to that. But a serious answer won't be a quip or a jingle. It won't be entertainment. It will be hard work. So let's talk about asteroids. Suppose there's an asteroid about to collide with the planet Earth. And well, one proposal would be, we need to decide what to do. So one thing you could say is, well, in deciding what to do, we should couch our answer to that question within the framework of a broader philosophical framework that starts by asking, what would be the thing to do under ideal conditions?
Favorites is How to Deserve, in which the answer enriches a central debate in political philosophy, while defying everyone's efforts to associate Dave with one side or other of the debate. Well, that's classic Dave Schmidtz, that enrichment of a central debate in which Dave doesn't take sides, but illuminates with deep insight and honesty. He'll be enriching our series today with his talk, Ideal for Real, Realistic Hopes for American Politics.
Thank you so much. So thank you. I'm touched by that introduction, and it really is an honor to be back in Ithaca, where I haven't been for a while. It's funny what can happen to make a place feel like home, and sometimes it's mysterious what makes a place feel like home, or what makes it coming back to a place feel like coming home. But actually, in my case, I know exactly why that is. It was 1992, 93, in there somewhere. Was the first time I came out to Ithaca, and I gave a seminar in the philosophy department. And there's this fellow in the audience. I mean, Richard Miller doesn't really need an introduction. He introduced himself, but he's as good as they come and as famous as they come in our field. And even back then, when I was just starting out, I knew, to look and scope out the audience and see, okay, that guy. There's Terry Irwin, and there is Dick Miller. So, and what could I expect? But I finished my talk, and then there was questions, and Dick's hands, both hands, I think, were the first.
My name is Dick Miller. I teach in philosophy, and I'm director of the program in ethics and public life. This is the third in our series of talks on deep issues of the 2012 elections, equality, freedom, and democracy. Our speaker is David Schmidtz. He's Kendrick Professor of Philosophy at the University of Arizona, where he also has a joint appointment in economics. At the University of Arizona, he's founding director of the Center for the Philosophy of Freedom. In his wide-ranging work, Dave Schmidtz places fundamental emphasis on freedom. He deeply connects freedom with private property, and he emphasizes the role of free enterprise in prosperity. In some people, these emphases are accompanied by a certain distance from the lived experience and concrete realities of choice, aspiration, neediness, and suffering. In Dave's case, nothing could be farther from the truth. A philosopher whom Dave and I both admire has said that an ethic is the love of a way of life. With searching insight, deep sympathy, great open-mindedness, Dave always sheds light on the great human question of what ways of life are worthy of love. Some people write influentially. Some people write in stimulating ways. Those people are not always the same. Dave's wide-ranging work is invariably both influential and stimulating. It includes such books as Rational Choice and Moral Agency, Social Welfare and Individual Responsibility, an effective debate with Robert Gooden, The Elements of Justice, and Person, Polis, and Planet. Planet being an emblem of Dave's work on environmental ethics, including the deepest, most puzzling questions about what a human's relation with nature ought to be. It includes many articles as well. One of my favorite.
Hands up, and he was not going to take no for an answer, so he got called on and said, "Do you realize your work has this implication?" And I said, "Well, yeah." "What? Shoot me." And he said, "Yeah, no, I thought that too. I was just checking to see if it had." I have another question. Do you think, I mean, when I put this work and this other thing, when I put them together, doesn't it have that implication? And I said, "Well, yeah, it does." I hadn't really thought, but yeah, it does. So, okay, what? Shoot me. And he said, no, I just think that's really interesting. It's a tremendously fruitful, I mean, this is really a research agenda. I mean, it's going someplace that has all these implications. I said, well, yeah, so that's it. That's it. I just wanted to say, oh, okay. So this is, like Dick says, I'm not a fellow that he spends a lot of his time agreeing with, but nevertheless, he still saw something in what I was doing, and I will never forget that. I will never stop being grateful for him doing something he really didn't need to do at all, which was to make me feel visible. And hi, John. Yeah, so that's why I feel here like I'm coming home. So what do you think of this? All men desire by nature to agree. Do you agree? I mean, of course, you shouldn't. If Aristotle had actually said that, he would have been talking about something that's actually, I would say, true. I would say we know that. It's pretty well confirmed by psychology today that is true of us. But that's something lamentable, not what Aristotle meant to be talking about. But this is actually one of the standard translations of the first line of the Metaphysics, actually. This is more like it. This, to have that desire, not to agree, but to desire to understand. To have that desire is to have achieved something, to have become something, not lamentable, but glorious. I mean, there's something admirable about being a creature aptly described by those words. Now, as theorists, it seems we do kind of idolize the idea of having views that can't reasonably be rejected, to use Scanlon's phrase. But suppose that you have two map makers, and maybe they're in your cartography class, and you assign them independently to map the same terrain, and they come up with identical maps. You would know that they cheated. People thinking independently, each desiring to understand, come up with different maps even if no one has made a mistake. Right? You can count on it. So long as people are thinking that's how it's going to be, and there's nothing bad about that. So thinking we should all be working with the same map, it's pointless. This is one of the only cultures in human history where your religion wasn't a reason to kill you. That's a big achievement. And how did that happen? Well, part of it was about a fellow named Roger Williams, who realized we don't need to be on the same page. We don't need to restrict ourselves into believing or saying what can't reasonably be rejected either. Right? That would be stifling. All we need to settle is who makes the call regarding any given person's religion or beliefs in general. We need to settle whose life it is, whose jurisdiction it is. That's about it. We can say the people made you who you are, provided the society in which you could become what you are, and therefore the people should choose your religion. Well, 4 centuries ago, Roger Williams realized how bogus that inference is, and he went on to invent America. Or actually, I should say something more complimentary. He invented America as it should have been. He bought Rhode Island with his own money from the Narragansett tribes. He didn't take it, he bought it. Every acre in Rhode Island was purchased. And he was, in effect, the father of a Rhode Island Constitution that went on to be the inspiration for the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So as teachers, we don't think that the gold standard of effective teaching is whether students agree with us. The gold standard is we give students something to think about. That's what grown-up teachers do. That's what made us love our best teachers. That's what made them our best teachers.